folks. Welcome to ASP's webinar. We'll give a couple minutes here for everybody to come in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. I see people still coming in, so we'll give it one more minute here before we get started. Thank you all for being with us.
And Jed, your tie does not look too ready.
I think you just outed my tie publicly.
Oops. Was that one of those live mic moments?
On my call this morning, I was in the best part of my talk and the cat just marched right across here. So
Oh, yeah.
There's not much my tie can do to compete with that.
Mine once crawled up and sat on the top of my head.
They do
Try
that.
holding on to your gravitas when you've got some Monty Python's parrot on your head.
Been there.
Just keep going.
All right, reclaiming my time, as they say on the Hill. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am Andrew Holland, Chief Operating Officer of the American Security Project. Thank you all for being with us today for the second event in our Looking Beyond the First 100 Days series. Yesterday, we had a great conversation about how the Biden administration and Congress can tackle challenges of climate change and national security. Today, we're talking about how to rebuild America's image abroad. These are several of the pillars that American Security Project was founded to research and to talk about. Our event series is really a part of our motto, vision, strategy, and dialogue, where we look beyond the headlines today, figure out a strategy of how to get where we want to be, and then have the dialogue to actually build those policies. Over the last 4 years, U.S. soft power, something intrinsically hard to define, has very clearly declined. ASP concluded that part of the reason for that was that our rhetoric hasn't been matching our values or our actions. Today, we're joined by experts in this field to discuss how the Biden administration can begin to rectify this and move forward on this. I'm going to give brief introductions for each of them. Then I'm going to turn it over to them for 5 to 10 minutes of opening remarks, and then we're going to have a discussion. I'd encourage all of our participants to use the Q&A chat button below to insert questions. I'll make sure that your questions get answered, and we look forward to having a great discussion. Ambassador Barbara Bodine is Distinguished Professor in the Practice of Diplomacy and Concurrent Director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Ambassador Bodine's over 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service were spent primarily in the Arab world and on greater Persian Gulf issues, specifically U.S. bilateral and regional policy, strategic security issues, counterterrorism, and governance and reform. Her tour as ambassador to the Republic of Yemen, 1997 to 2001, saw enhanced support for democratization and increased security and counterterrorism cooperation. Ambassador Bodine also served in Baghdad as Deputy Principal Officer during the Iran-Iraq War, Kuwait as Deputy Chief of Mission during the Iraqi invasion and occupation of 1990 to 91, and again, seconded to the Department of Defense in Iraq in 2003 as the Senior State Department official and the first coalition coordinator for reconstruction in Baghdad and the Central Governorates. Jed Willard is director of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Center for Global Engagement at Adams House, Harvard University. The FDR Center honors the 32nd American president's legacy by pursuing solutions to current global challenges while keeping in mind their historical origins. Over the past decade, Jed has been pleased to consult on a number of governments and other international actors, helping them to understand prevalent and emerging narratives, the drivers of public opinion and sentiment, and creating strategies and structures to effectively engage citizens around the globe. Matthew Wallin is the Fellow for Public Diplomacy here at the American Security Project, where he's performed research and analysis of the United States' influence and soft power for the past 9 years. He holds a master's degree in public diplomacy from the University of Southern California. Thank you all for being with us. Really an honor to have you all with us. I believe, Jed, you were going to start the conversation, and then we'll go from there. So over to you, Professor Willard.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm afraid I'm not a professor, but I have a terrible professorial habit of questioning the question, which is exactly how I plan to start this conversation. The question of what do we do, or what does the incoming Congress and Biden administration do about helping to improve American soft power or restore American soft power, it can be interpreted in a few different ways. I was thinking about this and I thought of 4 different, let's call them scopes, within which we can view the question. The smallest, the most limited scope is to ask, what can the State Department do? Because public diplomacy, as we all know, resides within the State Department. What can the State Department do? How can it restructure itself so as to better execute American public diplomacy? I call this the rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic response. So that's the most limited scope. To look at it in a slightly broader way, we can ask, let's take a more expansive interpretation of public diplomacy and ask, how can Congress and the White House reevaluate the US government's overall approach to American soft power? And this is the standard whole of government response. But there's a third scope that's bigger than even the second. And that is, why don't we reinterpret public diplomacy and not necessarily reinterpret soft power, and ask, how can leadership generate the elite and or public political will to do something real and holistic about American soft power? Let's call this the whole of society approach. What are the tools that we have that aren't necessarily in our standard toolbox? That's the whole of society approach. And then finally, and most expansively, we could ask, how do we begin to change the underlying fabric of the United States in a way that will, in the long run, greatly strengthen American soft power in a 21st century of renewed great power competition? And I'm going to call that fourth approach the how to rebuild our city on the hill response. So there's 4 ways we can address the question. And I don't think the answers are the same to each one. In fact, I'm quite confident that they're not. And so I'd like to start out by setting us with those 4 different scopes, and let's see where we can go with one of them or more, and how the conversation plays out.
Jed, thank you, and I think that's a good beginning to talk about what we need to do and where to go. Ambassador Bodine, as in your experience as a practitioner in this field, do you think that's a good angle? Those are good angles to look at, and what else do we need to be thinking about as we move forward?
I always admired my academic colleagues' ability to set up frameworks because they're useful. They help focus the mind and the conversation. And I think my answer to Jed's 4 options is all the above. It's not doing any one of those, but looking at them holistically. Certainly the bureaucratic structural question of where do you put public diplomacy in the State Department and what is the role of a public diplomacy officer abroad is important, and it needs to be addressed. But if it is a little bit of chairs on the Titanic, and I'm not quite sure we've run full into the iceberg, but we have had a captain who seems to be aiming at them. The real issue for public diplomacy, if you see it as sort of the salesmanship of US policy, is it has to have a product. It is a skill set. It is one of the tools of policy, but it doesn't operate in a vacuum. And where our soft power lies, where the city on the hill resided, was in our values and our principles and the aspirational nature of what America represented. Wasn't necessarily our reality. We have been very good at being very candid about our faults, and people have watched us fight through them. But the aspirations were what was important around the world. What did we believe in and what were we working toward? Not the idea that we had somehow attained it. So it's our political values. It's something as simple as the Declaration of Independence. But it has to be tied to policy. And this is where I think we've had the greatest problem in the last several years, is that to the extent that our policies are out of sync with our values and principles, then you have an almost impossible task. You can do the best marketing in the world, but if the product that you're trying to sell is unpalatable, people won't buy it because it's got a nice label on it. It involves both how we act at home and how we act abroad. And to kind of give you just one example of what that power was and how it affected folks, I had a Yemeni colleague friend who was really one of the drivers of reform and liberalization in Yemen. And he had gone to the States, as, if you can imagine, as an 18-year-old kid out of the mountains of Yemen in the mid-1950s and was dropped at Georgia Tech. I have no idea what that kind of culture clash looked like. But he was here in Georgia during the height of the civil rights movement. And then he went to do his PhD at Yale, and he was around for the height of the anti-war movement. And he also watched the women's liberation movement. And he came back to Yemen with we can do this too. And he said the primary lesson he learned from watching the chaos and sometimes violence of civil rights, anti-war, and women's liberation was that it's a work in progress and that it's constantly having to be driven and move forward, and that there was no perfect end game. And that inspired him and an awful lot of other Yemenis I knew who went to school in the States or Britain and Canada. That's what inspired them. And it was not the size of our military. It was not necessarily the size of our economy. It wasn't our movies. It was what we stood for. And within that context, then I could explain what we were trying to do as a government in the region. Sometimes it didn't match up quite as well as it should have, but that gave us the basis to have conversations, is that we were credible, we were legitimate, and we were principled. And if you have, that's what public diplomacy really needs to be able to be based on. And then you can work on how do you build the policies. I think for Biden, are we committed to multilateralism? And multilateralism in the sense of actually talking to, listening to, seeing other countries, peoples, and issues three-dimensionally, not two-dimensionally and not transactionally. How do we handle the crises that we've been going through over the last several months? Is this the end of democracy, or did democracy did our institutions and our principles hold? So that's where you really need to put it. The rest of it, does Congress give us the money? Do we have enough public diplomacy officers? All of this, those are the mechanics of it. But the real thing is to get back to our principles and have people believe that we once again believe them, even if we don't always manage to manifest them.
Ambassador, thank you. Matthew, I think that's an important sort of jumping off point towards the work that you've done at ASP, talking about how to align American values with actions and policies and goals. I mean, Declaration of Independence is a great example of the American creed, but at the time it wasn't true that we actually had all men created equal, endowed by their creator with certain ideals. It is a work in progress. So how do you square these two things?
That's certainly true, Andrew, and I think that goes well with the sort of remarks that I put together here. And I've been writing about this issue for some time now. That our needs, our deeds, and our actions need to match our rhetoric and the supposed ideals that we stand for. There's been a lot of damage to the American message in the last number of years, and that's not exclusive to the Trump administration. I've been writing about this, during the Obama administration as well. Where sometimes we'll say something, but then we don't follow through on our promises to do those things. And that causes damage to the message. I think of this somewhat as that, the American message needs a pedigree. Now, the beginnings of that pedigree are evident in the ideas that we stand for, those founding documents. However, the damage that's been done to that pedigree over time has really sort of diluted it. And we're not really at the point where we've got sort of a thoroughbred message here. Getting to that point is going to take some time, and it's going to take some consistency over administrations. If anything, administrations from other countries have been really good at pointing this out. They've been really good at sort of cleaving the say-do gap that we've had in our country for quite some time. And while there are major events that the U.S. has undertaken over the years that have done quite a lot to improve our message, whether that's our actions in the Second World War, building the international system, putting a man on the moon, soon to be a woman on the moon, hopefully. These things have effect and they lend to the message, but they don't necessarily solve all the problems. And with the advent of social media today, all of the flaws are on wide display at any given time, 24/7. There's no curation of it. And our adversaries have taken advantage of this. Now, Eisenhower in the 50s understood this, and he knew this well. And he specifically said during the beginnings of the larger, civil rights movement, that the Soviets were very keen on showing all of these hypocrisies that were taking place within the American system, and that posed a major danger, not only to the US, but to the conduct of US foreign policy around the world. So I'm faced with trying to figure out what America stands for at this point, and it's difficult to say. Now, we can name a few things, freedom of speech in the press. You'd like to say that, but the last number of years have, I think, highlighted that that's maybe not so in all cases. Rule of law, equal justice. The Black Lives Matter movement over the summer has really brought this to the light, showing that if we don't believe that we have rule of law or equal justice, it's kind of hard to profess that upon the rest of the world. But if anything, the movement over the summer has also been one of the major forms of American soft power that's actually been effective overseas. We've seen people overseas take this message and make it part of their own to fight the own perceived injustices they see within their societies. Other important things, and we talk frequently about the peaceful transition of power and how this is supposed to be a model that other countries should follow around the world. And we've stated that for all the troubles that we have, we always are able to maintain this tradition. And I think as of a week ago today, we can say that's no longer an effective argument, and something that I think we're all pretty concerned about. Ideas of trustworthiness, the truth, questionable today. And I think a large amount of our credibility is going to depend on how we respond to all the stuff that's gone on in the past 4 years, including what happened in the last week at the Capitol. But it doesn't seem that even in the midst of this that we're willing to do this. Secretary Pompeo gave a speech at VOA the other day, which was essentially completely tone deaf. He was talking about issues of importance to the truth, touting VOA's first broadcast, about the importance of the truth, whether it is good or bad. And what we've seen is that the highest levels of the United States government for some years have really had zero commitment to it. And that's really hard to deal with in terms of the disinformation sphere that we're dealing with nowadays. And in response to this, just based on the Pompeo speech, there was a VOA reporter who was doing her job asking Pompeo about what happened at the Capitol, and the response of VOA was to basically take her out of her position and demote her. And if we're trying to use this as an example of demonstrating commitment to American ideals, then we're not doing it here at home. And foreign publics are seeing this. We see some, and there's all sorts of statistics that are out in terms of how foreign publics are perceiving the United States. We can look at the relationship between the United States and Germany right now, where 80% of Germans believe that the relations with the United States are bad. And there's a complete flip of that opinion in the US, where the 74% of Americans think that relations with Germany are good. So there's a complete misperception between these two societies on what they think of each other. We look at the way Canada views us right now, and they've got travel advisories for the United States that say demonstrations may occur, even peaceful demonstrations can turn violent at any time. This is the type of thing that we would be issuing in a US travel advisory for other countries. And many countries around the world have issued statements in their travel advisory saying that that those countries are basically warning about the risk of a mass shooting. So, if these are the views that both foreign publics and foreign governments are expressing towards the United States, I think that's very worrying. And I don't think that, Biden coming into office is going to magically fix this. I do think there's going to very likely be a bubble of support and increased goodwill and trust and admiration amongst towards the United States, much as there was when President Obama came into office. But that doesn't necessarily translate into policies getting done or being accomplished or being able to use public diplomacy to affect these. I think where we can use it and where we can take advantage of it, we should. But it's not good enough for a bubble to exist during particular administrations. There needs to be more consistency from administration to administration, not only in how we approach our values, but we really need to focus on rebuilding the consensus around what our country stands for, how it behaves overseas, and how we look at ourselves so that we understand also how foreign publics look at us. And I can get a little bit into my ideas about how to fix this, but I'll be quiet for now and move the conversation.
Yeah, I was muted. The classic Zoom thing. Thank you, Matthew, and thanks for talking on this. I think it's really important to kind of drill down on that. Ambassador Bodine, you had a quick response.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree with you that particularly, although maybe not solely, under this administration, our profile abroad has been damaged. The question is, has it been damaged beyond repair? And it would be interesting to, on some of these polls, like the Germans thinking that, our relationship is bad. If you could actually disaggregate that, how much of that is the current administration and how much of that is a deeper view of the United States? Now, I do think that if Trump had been reelected and therefore the world would see that, a majority of Americans had voted for him, they would have begun to conclude that what he represented was who we want to be and who we are. The fact that he was not reelected for anybody here that's a surprise, I apologize. He did not win the vote. There's going to be a period of waiting to see if we can re-engage on a values-based, principle-based foreign policy and how we address the problems at home. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. While that was seen in some countries, and certainly I saw as, yes, a retching examination of the inequities in our system writ large and our judicial system most specifically. But in talking to friends from abroad, the fact that we could have those protests, that it could be brought out, it could be argued with all the problems was, we can't even do that here. We can't have that. The fact that you can have protests where you're questioning the basics of your judicial system can be a good if something comes from it. Pompeo doesn't have very much credibility. As you may know, the Europeans just suggested that he skip Europe on his trip. And so there is, I think, a greater ability abroad to separate out an administration from a people, as long as you have something like, we will have a peaceful transfer of power. Not as peaceful, not as gracious as it has been, but at the end of the day, it will happen. At the end of the day, the systems and the institutions held. And that's kind of the message that I think the international community is going to see Biden try to build on and build from. But I think you're also quite right, to the extent that we kind of go through these 4-year cycles, there's going to be this question, what happens in 4 years? Do we go forward or do we revert? And so that's a piece of our credibility that I think is going to be beyond Biden to repair, because they need to see the sustainability of any changes, not that it just becomes cyclical.
Thank you. A question for you, Jed. Does any of this actually matter? When we talk about the polling on Germans, 80%, 74% not supporting America. I mean, it's not like that is completely undermining the ability of the U.S. government and the German government to work together. But at the same time, what does this matter? I really do like that. We had a question here from somebody on your whole of society approach, and she goes further into more actors, including non-governmental actors, people-to-people diplomacy, and how to better integrate. And I think that's right. But are we worried that we can just overlook some of this? What do you think?
I deeply appreciate the question. Whole of society is everyone's goal. It's very difficult to utilize, to steer, but nothing is going to steer it other than political direction. So it's definitely worth trying, and there are ways that you can start to do it. It's not easy, but it's definitely a must do. So I guess I'm going to try to answer with great optimism and also affirmation for my fellow panelists. I don't worry that much about the 80% of Germans who aren't big fans of the United States right now, because as it turns out, the United States and Germany are working together closely now, and we certainly will be working very closely together this year. We're tight buddies and allies, and there are extremely close connections. There are some differences that we have with Germany, but they're detailed, and they have to do with pipelines and certain attitudes. But if here's an optimistic note. In preparation for this call, I reached out to public diplomacy experts in 12 countries And I asked them, these are not public diplomacy, these are not current diplomats. They are experts who are either from academia, former diplomats, or political managers on the international stage, people like that. I asked them, well, what should the incoming Congress and administration do to improve American soft power? What can we do? And 10 of them responded, and these are 10 different countries from all over the world, and they all had very specific ideas, and they were all extremely local. They said, well, you're going to have to address TPP, because us in Southeast Asia, there's nothing more important than this trade agreement. And also, by the way, you got to help us out with China. In Northern Europe, it was climate, climate, climate. And also, can you please re-engage with us so we can talk to you? They were all very local and specific issues. And this is good. This is good because it means we have opportunities. We have public diplomacy opportunities to engage and get quick wins at the local level. We can focus country to country. We have country teams who can focus on getting these quick wins and appealing to these publics rapidly and in the areas that they want us to focus on. And it also means that there are very fast opportunities to make quick wins in the overall, this principles dynamic, the idea of getting America back to our constant work in progress based on certain core principles place. More than half the people that I spoke with said, oh yeah, the Biden administration is going to have a little bit of a window to really impress us, and we are waiting. We're waiting for the hug. We've been waiting for the hug for years, and we want the hug. Come and give us the hug, and those numbers are going to change really quickly. They're not. It's not sustainable. The hugs don't hold forever, but it helps in a bit. And if you get that hug, and then you get those local wins, you're really helping out with your public diplomacy. So just one piece of bad news is that, again, half of the folks that I spoke with said, you know, you have a really big problem, and your problem is you. Your problem is your polarization. Your problem is that one or the other, wasn't always the same one, of your parties is either crazy or antithetical to my government. They all brought this up, not all, half of them brought this up, and they questioned our credibility. As the ambassador said, you have to, well, a number of people have said it, you have to sustain this over time. Okay, you've got a small window to make some difference, but really you're not credible if all of your policies switch every 4 years or every 2. They reacted with alarm over our polarization, mind you. One of them said, you have to understand that diplomacy isn't politics. We don't want to have diplomatic agreements with one of your parties. We want to have it with the United States of America. I've actually heard that from a number of different countries, some of whom don't really have much of a choice. They fall into this unfortunate trap. And then back to the principles part. Again, half of the people I spoke with said, we need leadership. We need the United States to lead in the West. Now, we don't need you to lead the way you've been leading. We need new ideas and we need new messages, but especially we need leadership. And we are waiting for that. We are waiting for you to re-engage with the world. And by re-engaging with the world, we can get more, again, quick wins, quick public diplomacy wins. Maybe in the first 100 days, perhaps. Bless you. And they want us to re-engage for a number of reasons. And again, most of these were local. The only 2 that came up repeatedly were because our other choice is China. We're not excited about that. And also, someone's got to lead on climate change. And we're all waiting for you to get back into, if not that driver's seat, at least into the passenger seat. Please, the United States, climate change.
Jed, let me ask you though, and go right to you, Barbara, afterwards. Let me ask you, there's a question here about, you're right that the publics may want this, but what about when you're engaging with a country that could have a strong difference between their own public and their government? You know, if we're returning to a values-driven message, there are governments around the world, and I'm thinking especially in the part of the world where Ambassador Bodine served in the Arab world, that are not representative governments and are authoritarian, that have been quite close allies of the United States. Does this mean that there needs to be a sort of revision of American attitudes towards these governments?
Well, Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, first of all, I agree that we need some quick wins to show. And my understanding is that the Biden administration has a stack of about 87 day one things to do, starting with Paris climate, somehow re-engaging in TPP or son of TPP, the WHO, and the 13 different agreements, conventions, and organizations that we walked away from. And that has to be done very quickly. You know, we're serious, we're back. I would balance that by saying that the world did not stand still for 4 years. And for example, in Asia, when we walked away from the TPP, the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Australians got together and did a son of TPP, except they included China, which they had to because we had walked away. And so the idea that we get to go straight back to the Papa chair, I think, I'm not quite sure we get to do that. We get to, maybe we're in the front seat, but we may not be behind the steering wheel anymore, or at least we have to re-earn that. When you're dealing with, sometimes we have governments who agree with us and the people are skeptical, and other places, you know, we're the shiny city on the hill to the people and the governments aren't quite sure about us. That's what diplomacy is all about. Part of this is how you live those values and interests and how you incorporate them into what you do. If we go in, and I think this is, you know, we want you to lead, but maybe not exactly as you did before. Going under the George W. administration, we had a very coercive democratization approach. You know, you will be, there was a bumper sticker, you know, you'll be a democracy, or we'll shoot you, you know, our way into it. It has to be more of a conversation. It has to be finding out who you can work with locally in a way that supports them, doesn't get them in trouble. And a really good PD messaging and diplomacy is not that this is what we want you to do because it will make us happy. That is not a good approach. It's, this is something that is in your interest. This is how it fits with you. And so I'm not trying to get you to make me happy. I am coming to you as something that will move you forward. Doesn't always work. And sometimes it does have to be coercive if you're dealing with a truly autocratic regime. I served in Iraq. I did not spend a lot of time trying to get Saddam Hussein to agree with us. So that's a different set of lines and paths you need to walk. But we need to be values-based, principle-based in our policy, but not be coercive in trying to impose them on others. I was on a panel decades ago where some guy said, well, yes, our role, our mission is to go out and create little Americas around the world. No, it's not. Our mission is to find those who are looking for reform or liberalization or other changes and figure out how to help them along that path, recognizing they have a work in progress. And then sometimes if it is, if it's a wholly autocratic, exploitive regime, part of our role is speaking truth to that power, which helps empower those within the community who are looking for change. It's hard. It's very hard, but we need to talk about our values and principles and believe that they are universal, as opposed to these are American principles and values that you need to adapt and adopt.
Thank you, Ambassador. A couple questions here that I'm going to pose to Matthew. that are kind of in the what is to be done sort of ideas. Somebody talks about the idea for a new diplomatic reserve corps and also a 2.0 version of the USIA. What are your views on kind of the internal restructuring, whether you want to talk about it within the State Department or broader within the US government? We've talked some about the whole of society and needing to fix our own problems. What in the actual, running the government sort of stuff, what is to be done that would be helpful in supporting US public diplomacy efforts?
So I'm not when it comes to USA, I'm gonna say it straight out: is people need to get off that horse.
Yes.
People have been talking about doing that for
Thank
20
you.
years now. It's not going to happen. If it does happen, great. If it doesn't, it's inconsequential to what the actual American message is and the general behavior of our country. This gets a little bit into Jed's, rearranging the deck chairs. The State Department just went through a big reorganization. They created the Global Public Affairs Agency. They moved stuff all around. If there is a role for government that is, somewhat useful, yeah, maybe that can help a little bit. If we're trying to keep enough people, able to get into the lifeboats in time for the Carpathia to rescue them, then yeah, sure, rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, give us a few extra minutes. But it's going to take something, I think, much more significant. In terms of the actual things we can do, I've been a little pessimistic over the last few years, wondering if there is an ability for government to do this. And I've even suggested that it's really the role of our civil society to take the lead in this. But, even I'm starting to address some skepticism about whether our society is capable of doing this, given what we just witnessed in our own capital just last week. But I do think there are a few concrete things that either our society or our government can do. One is that we just need to focus on setting a better example at home. That's doing the things like I mentioned before. That's closing the say-do gap. That's matching the rhetoric with our actions and with ideals and our realities. And that we need to choose to be different from the Russias and Chinas of the world, who are out there spreading disinformation. We need to make the principled choice not to behave the same way that they do, so that when they're stuck going, well, do we have to choose China because they're the only ones that are present? We need to give people a reason to choose the United States. We need to do something about the coronavirus. This is something that was recently cited by many foreign publics as being a large factor in their diminishing public opinion towards the US. In the recent Pew survey that was done, basically all the countries that they surveyed said that the US response to coronavirus is the worst response of any country in the world, basically. And that's just embarrassing when we're supposed to be the most powerful, capable, scientifically advanced country in the world. If we're not able to deal with a pandemic, that's a problem. And to just put in perspective how bad it is at this point, we've got 4,500 deaths per day. That's, compared to D-Day, there were 2,500 American deaths. So we're facing more than almost two D-Days per day at this point. And that looks ridiculous when our solution for this has been mostly focused on blaming China as opposed to developing systems to lead ourselves and the world out of this pandemic. It takes leadership. We need to be inclusive rather than exclusive. Unless it's involving Nazis, we should always exclude Nazis. But we need to find better ways to include foreign publics in America's goals and our message. We need to find out the things that they value so that when you're dealing with, say, these governments that are perhaps not reflective of their people, it's the listening aspect. It's the understanding of where we can have influence in those societies and how to exert that. We need to give them a stake in our success, and we need to strengthen international institutions rather than simply attacking them. We need to provide counterweight in these institutions where the bad actors are otherwise exerting too much influence. But we really need to focus on involving foreign publics as opposed to dictating to foreign publics what should happen. We need to lead, and that means getting rid of the America First ideology, and that's pretty obvious at this point that that's going to be disappearing. But we need to get into a leadership position where we realize that our success is contingent on the success of our partners and our allies. We need to establish a forward-leaning posture which clearly states our international objectives and making sure that those objectives are consistent with our ideas and are realistically achievable. And we must articulate the means by which these objectives can be achieved through the cooperation of our allies, as well as the benefits that those allies will receive by participating in those. And of course, we must lead by example. And then finally, and this touches a little bit on the coronavirus situation, exchange programs are going to be really important. Now, there is a reasonable amount of skepticism on what exchange programs can accomplish, but at the same time, you know, when we talk about the last 3 feet being so important in public diplomacy, it's really hard to close those last 3 feet when we're all stuck at minimum of 6 feet apart, or we're all conversing with each other over Zoom. You can't really build the same types of relationships.
Define that for those of us who aren't.
Just as part of this.
What's that mean for those of us who aren't? The last 3 feet for those of us who aren't PD professionals.
That's just really the factor of getting in person and building a personal relationship with someone. Because when it comes to conducting foreign policy or getting goals done, it's all based on people's individual decisions, and those decisions can be based on the relationships that they have with people.
Yeah. The phrase actually came from Edward R. Murrow, who is considered the godfather of public diplomacy. But
and I think as sort of a last,
and it goes to the core that you know, all of this has to do with building relationships and building, therefore, the credibility that go with those.
And I think it's really important as part of that to make sure that we're sending more Americans abroad, particularly those that live in the internal parts of the country and the red states. We need to get people out of the country, and rather than viewing it all about how, you know, America has all these great messages for the rest of the world, there are things we can learn from the rest of the world and bring back to the United States to improve our own societies, whether that's how we deal with extremism or how we get the trains to run on time. There are countries around the world that do certain things better than we do, and we should take those and use them to our advantage.
You mean that as an official government policy? There should be an official government policy to distribute passports and get people?
Well, on the good side of things, passport access is easier. More Americans do have passwords. Well, that's a whole other conversation. Passports than they did, say, 20 years ago. But, you know, whether that's getting more people involved in exchange programs, you know, we're not at a 1-to-1 exchange ratio by any means. And I think it's important for Americans to get out and understand the rest of the world in order to see both how we're perceived and to take those things that are important and bring them back. So yes, the government can have a role in encouraging and incentivizing this. You know, I leave it up to the legislators to figure out exactly how to do that.
Well, I think actually, you know, the idea of sending a lot of Americans abroad is a nice idea. I'm not sure that they would necessarily, they won't always have the kind of experience you're talking about. But one thing that I have always been a very strong proponent of are student exchanges. And, you know, I've been at a number of universities that have a very high percentage of international students. And I actually spent my own junior year abroad. And I think that those exchange programs work tremendously, and they have been cut back, some of it because of visa bans and some of it because people take a look at what's going on here and aren't really sure they want to send their children here. But those are the formative years. And that's where this Yemeni friend of mine, as I said, you know, 18-year-old kid out of the mountains, came to the States and, you know, saw things, understood things, and was able to take them home. But he was also, you know, there were people in Georgia who were meeting some little 18-year-old kid from the mountains. I strongly support the exchange programs, and they need to be increased, but I think they are most effective when they're done at the college level, rather than taking a 50-year-old who's never been abroad and dropping them someplace. It doesn't generally work very often. I do want to kind of go back to you've become entirely cynical about the government doing anything and we should default to civil society. I don't see it as an either or. I see it as a partnership. We need civil society to be engaged. They can bring messages. They have skill sets that we don't have. But to go back to Jed's point about, people are looking for us to re-engage in some kind of leadership. The civil society world and the NGO world and all the other force multipliers that we have, if you like, they are looking for leadership from the government as well. They need to know that they're not representing, that their efforts are not being undercut by an administration that is divorced from principles and values, that seems divorced from our core norms. And so they are looking for the leadership. But yes, they have to be full partners in what we're trying to do, but it's not an alternative. It's a both.
Jed, over to you. What do you think what is to be done here? And to get to a question here that somebody had asked, foreign policy used to be bipartisan, and how to get back to that. Is there a real ability to get to bipartisanship here in public diplomacy? And how do we do that?
Those are two good questions. To the first one about government versus civil society. When I mentioned those quick wins country by country, I was thinking of the U.S. government. I was actually thinking of public diplomacy professionals in those countries doing their work at the embassy and at the consulates. They can do that. That's a government thing. And they can also be Sherpas for U.S. private sector. They can do that too. But I was definitely thinking of them. So there's absolutely a huge role for government. And even at the whole of society, we need to get everyone on board level. There does need to be political leadership. I mean, that's what political leadership is. It's creating a vision that people are willing to follow, to work for. So that is politics. But to go to the other one about partisanship and foreign policy and how it seems that partisanship no longer stops at the water's edge. There are a lot of reasons for that, and one of them may very well be that it has become. It always has been, but more so now, perhaps, it's become easier to have a relationship with a party rather than with a nation. And that's a good thing, because it implies that power is diffused within countries. I don't know how good it is for the United States, and when you're trying to have a relationship with the United States, but it's good for us that we have to deal with multiple parties within other countries. That's better than having to only deal with the king. It's just better for all humanity. So that's a development, and I don't think it's a wholly bad development. I think it's bad when you become overly reliant on a single party. When we become overly reliant on a single party in another country, or they become reliant on a single party in our country. That's definitely a negative. But looking at it from the United States perspective and our foreign policy, can we come to agreements? This was not a private conversation. There were a lot of people in the room, but a couple of years ago, a U.S. ambassador, whom I will not name, actually there were two of them, but one of them said, and the other one agreed, that foreign guests, this was in Europe, foreign guests, please, we know that you are worried about the U.S. Administration. We know that you're worried about the direction that we're taking American rhetoric. Please try to look beyond the rhetoric. Look beyond the rhetoric and judge us for our policies and judge us for our actions. And they were confident. They were both Trump appointees, so maybe that's why they were confident. But they were confident that if you looked beyond the tweets and looked at the United States and what we were doing with and for those countries, that you would actually see something that you could recognize. And I don't fully agree with these guys. I think that there were some things that, policy choices that we made that were not in the interest of our friends and allies. But the idea that they could think that they thought they were acting in a way that was, if not bipartisan, at least traditionally American, recognizably, this is what you rely on America for. That they thought that, I found comforting.
Mhm.
And I had, it turned out I had reason to think that way, but it can't explain why, because it would give away some identities. But so it is possible. It is possible. I think when you get into closed rooms with senators from multiple parties, that you might hear something that you don't necessarily hear in speeches or in the media. And I'm sure you all experience this all the time because you're in those closed rooms. At the same time, there are real policy differences between the two parties right now in the United States that go even beyond policy, that go to the entire meaning of what the American experiment is. And that is necessarily going to bleed over into foreign policy decisions unless we manage to find either some middle ground or we shake up things.
Let's shake things up. I think an important note to begin to close on here as we think about looking beyond the first 100 days here of the Biden administration. Yes, let's shake things up. Don't worry about upsetting the deck chairs on the Titanic. Go out and change things around. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you to the participants. I'm going to ask if there's any final thoughts from any of our panelists here before we close out. We have about 2 minutes left. Any final thoughts from our panelists before we close out?
I remain optimistic about our country, with a full understanding of our problems, both immediate and long term. And I think that President-elect Biden and his cabinet, and apparently a majority of Americans, want us to re-engage, want us to live our values, and with all of the turmoil that sometimes, we make a lot of good trouble. Sometimes we make some really bad trouble. But I think that what we have been talking about, whether it's how we restructure the State Department or how we do a whole of government or how we do a whole of society, I think that, the basics are there and that it is possible. I was asked by a student last summer, if I had hope, which is a big question to get from a 20-year-old. But I do. I don't think that the experiment has failed. I think it's gone through a stress test, but I think the experiment is going to move forward. And I very much agree with Jed that the rest of the world is waiting for us to come back. We just need to be able to demonstrate that we are back and can stay back.
Well, I think a note of optimism is a good note to end on. So with that, let me thank all of our panelists. As I say in these Zoom times, normally we'd hear a round of applause from our audience, but what I'd say is that what you hear is the sound of one hand clapping. But everybody, thank you for your work with us. I'd encourage all of our participants to go to ASP's website, americansecurityproject.org, sign up for our newsletter, sign up for our podcast where we have weekly conversations on topics such as this. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you again tomorrow when we're going to talk about great power competition and the challenge of the rise of China. We look forward to that. And thanks again to our panelists. It's been a great conversation. Thank you to you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.